Right, David, you're chair of the Dorset Humanists, a very successful chair.
Mm.
How long have you actually been chair of the...
I've been chair for, this is my 11th year.
Mhm.
I promised I would only do it for 5 years, but the 5-year point came up and I just sort of carried on. So every year I do say to people, on the committee, if anyone wants this job, just let me know. But they all carry on letting me do it. So
You obviously do it so well, that's the thing. So, but there's another side to you that we maybe don't know about so well. There was a time when you would have called yourself a Christian. And I'm intrigued about that, because what changed your outlook? What happened to you? Was there anything particular, or was it a general thing?
Yeah. Well, just to give you the background briefly. I was brought up as a Christian, from a very early age. I went to an evangelical church, and the idea when you're an evangelical Christian is to invite Jesus into your life, to be your personal saviour, and I did that when I was aged 11. So as a teenager, I was quite a pious and enthusiastic Christian. So what changed my mind? I think there were two turning points really. One when I was about 18 or 19, and another when I was about 21. Just to give you the background, part of being a Christian was this idea of trusting in God and giving your life to God. And the way that kind of developed in my life was that the more I tried to trust God, there was almost like a sense of inertia in my own life, when I should have actually been getting on with my life, developing my own sense of autonomy as a teenager. I was constantly being fed this idea that, you must just trust God. It was like allowing God to almost be the manager of your life. I thought that was actually, looking back now, I think that's a really unhelpful, actually a harmful message to give, to actually give a teenager, and that's right, a passive way of living. So, and it wasn't really, it wasn't working at all for me. So that was the first turning point, was that my uncle gave me like a self-help book on psychology. And there was a phrase that leapt out of this book for me, which was the idea of believing in myself. And this was a complete revelation to me, the idea of believing in myself, in the sense of trusting in my own powers. And I just found that idea irresistible, really. So I started doing that because, the believing in God thing wasn't really working. I was expecting God to manage my life, and he wasn't managing my life, which was kind of a clue as to, whether God existed or not.
Yeah.
So that was the first turning point. The second turning point was a few years later when I was 23. By then I'd been to university. I'd studied theology for 3 years. It was with a view to becoming a Church of England vicar. When I was at university, I was studying philosophy of religion, and I learnt that philosophers like David Hume and Immanuel Kant had really kind of knocked out the philosophical arguments for the existence of God in the 18th century. They'd kind of demolished those arguments. So I thought, at the time I thought, this is okay. I've still got this kind of relationship with God. I still felt that I had a relationship with God in some subjective sense. But if I can just give you an analogy, David, I'm now talking to you. We have a kind of working relationship within the Humanist network. If I only had a subjective idea that we had a working relationship, and that I couldn't see you or hear you or touch you, then other people might start to think, I'm not sure about this David Warden guy. He's got a rather strange idea that this person, David Brittain, exists when no one's ever seen him or heard him or anything.
Lots of people would sooner I didn't. Go there.
So as a theology student, I was beginning to think, the only basis for my relationship with God is this subjective sense.
Mm-hmm.
But just given the analogy that I've just used, it kind of isn't really enough to just believe that you have a subjective sense of a relationship without any of the underpinning verifying data. Somebody is actually physically present. I mean, I could be hallucinating now, of course, but
We'll save that
don't
for later.
think I'm hallucinating. So it was actually a real crisis of faith. I was 23. I was just at the end of my theological studies. I was thinking of going to theological college to start my training as a priest in the Church of England, but I came to this crisis of faith, and I just couldn't maintain it any longer. I just had to sort of let go of the idea of God. So that was the second turning point, really.
So that was when you were 23.
Yeah.
So how long would you say you've been an active humanist? There's a difference, isn't there, between not being a believer and being a humanist?
Yeah. I've been an active humanist since I was 43. So there was a kind of 20-year gap between becoming an atheist and becoming an active humanist. I can fill you in a little bit with what happened, if you like.
If you can tell me the moment when you first discovered that you were a humanist, if you can.
Let me just fill you in a little bit of what happened after the age of 23. Even though by that stage I was an atheist, I still thought of myself as a Christian in a sense, because although I didn't believe in God, I kind of still had an attachment to this idea of Jesus and the ethics of Jesus. So I continued describing myself as a Christian. I was a kind of atheist Christian, if you like, for maybe a dozen years after that. And then I got very interested in investigating the historical existence of Jesus, and eventually became a complete skeptic about that subject as well. And once I came to the conclusion that Jesus didn't even exist as a historical person, that in itself is a long story, I really had to stop calling myself a Christian, because there was really nothing left. So it took me quite a long time to actually. I was aware of the British Humanist Association. I made one or two attempts to join. I think I did join, and then my membership lapsed. So I was, it was 2002. I was 43. I think by then I thought I really need to do something about this humanist idea. I got in touch with Dorset Humanists and joined Dorset Humanists about 17 years ago. But coming back to so you asked me the question, when did I first really become a humanist? It depends what you mean. I think in a way I became a humanist when I was 18 or 19 because of this idea of believing in myself, which is really the absolute core of being a humanist, is believing in yourself rather than outsourcing your kind of idea of what you are to a God. But the actual practical side of it and actually joining a humanist group came very much later, which is a pity in a way that I was already in my 40s, because humanism needs young people, and so there was a big gap between giving up Christianity and joining humanism.
It sounds as though you're very much guided by a philosophical approach to life. Not everyone does that, and you've taken steps in that direction, which most people don't go along. Would you say that the philosophy of your life, the way you conduct your life, is an important issue for you?
I think you can just see from all these books that I have around us, is partly an indication of that. I mean, I think I kind of got the bug for studying. I mean, I'm had a great interest in theology and philosophy at university, and I've really carried on with that. And so the stages in my life have kind of been guided by the development of my own thoughts on what all of that means.
So thank you for that, David. That's really interesting. But so we've reached the point where David Warden's a humanist, but you've done more than that. You've taken over the Dorset Humanists. You've been very successful. So why is humanism important enough for you to be a group organiser? How did you get involved into actually running a group? Or perhaps why?
Yeah, I mean, so the maybe two parts to that question. How did I get involved? I mean, prior to me becoming chairman of Dorset Humanists, we had a very successful chairwoman called Jane Bannister, who had been chairing the group for about 8 years, and she got to the point where she wanted to, stop doing it. And I think I was in a committee meeting, and it felt as though we had one of those little sort of spinning arrows on a board, and they span it round, and of course it was pointing to me, so that's kind of how it happened. But I was voted in, at the subsequent annual general meeting, so that's kind of how it happened. But the deeper question as to why I think it's important, my answer to this might be partly shaped by the fact that I was a Christian growing up. I think my attitude towards religion is that religion as an overarching organising principle for people, or for human beings, shall we say. I think human beings need a kind of overarching philosophy to understand their place in the world or their place in the universe. And I think once you knock that out, then what are people left with? They might be left with their work, they might be left with culture, they might be left with family, friends. All of those things are great. But I just feel that there's something missing if people don't have this overarching philosophy or a way of organising their understanding of what it means to be a human being on this planet. So I do think of humanism as, in a sense, a secular alternative to religion, and that's why I think it's important.
But apart from belief, do you find humanism is a moral guide for you, in the same way as perhaps religion might be for a Christian?
It's a bit different, because humanism doesn't have a book that says, you must read this book and these are the commandments and these are the rules and all the rest of it. I think what humanism enables people to do is have some basic principles, or some basic questions. So, for example, a good humanistic question, which goes all the way back to Socrates, is, what is a good life? What does it mean to live a good life? And that's such a fundamental question. Yeah. And humanists can spend their whole lives answering that question for themselves. And I think that's the beauty of a humanist group, is that you can get together with other people who think that's such a great question, and there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer to it, but we can all find our own path together in answering that kind of question.
But there are some basic rules that humanists live by, aren't there? It's being kind to others, considerate to other people.
Yeah. And I think all of those things are, in a sense, they are common sense. But I think as a humanist, you kind of consciously sign up to those basic ideas of living a good and ethical life.
So, what are the most important issues facing humanism in the UK today? What are the big issues that humanists have to address, do you think?
I think the biggest one is still recognition. Organised humanism started roughly 150 years ago, about the same time as some rather, let's say, modern religions like the Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormonism. Those religions have been hugely more successful than organised humanism, and I find that very frustrating. Because I think humanism is a great idea, but we're still struggling to really get it recognised and really successful. So I think recognition of humanism is a really big issue.
So, just coming back to your time as chair of Dorset Humanists, you taken over from this lady some years ago now, Jane, and you've been very, very successful. The Humanist fraternity, you're one of the most successful groups in the country. So what do you put that success down to? And do you have any recipe for success that other humanist groups might follow?
How much are you prepared to pay for my recipe? No, okay.
We have to ask Humanist UK for that.
Yeah, I think. I mean, I do have a passion for it. I mean, I think I've kind of explained where that passion comes from. I think if you've got a passion for it, then that's the first step, and you've maybe either got that or you haven't. What comes after that is just hard work. Well, it's kind of dedication and hard work. So I am kind of dedicated to it. On a personal level, it's probably the best job I've ever had, but the pay is terrible. No pay at all. Before I became chairman of Dorset Humanists, I didn't really believe, going back to this idea of believing in myself, in a sense I didn't believe that I could be a leader of an organisation. I think it's partly because in my working life as a trainer, I worked in various organisations that I felt sort of semi-detached. My relationship was kind of semi-detached. I didn't really buy into the corporate culture, and I didn't really feel like climbing the greasy pole or anything like that. So I was a trainer, which enabled me to have a professional career, but without sort of going up the ladder, as it were. But I feel totally comfortable in the world of humanism, and so it's been good for me to be able to lead a humanist group. So coming back to the idea of a recipe for success, it's kind of just dedication and hard work and good diplomatic skills. You do need good diplomatic skills.
Not exactly blood, sweat and tears, but
not blood, sweat and tears.
No.
There's a lot of pleasure to be had, but dedication, I would say.
I can certainly attest to that. As a humanist, you get to meet some amazing people, and it's a wonderful privilege, actually. You've already part answered, this is the last question, but you've already part answered this, I think. What longer term aims do you think the humanist movement should have?
Yeah. One of the early pioneers of humanism in this country was an American called Stanton Coit.
Yeah.
And he had the idea that humanism would replace the Church of England. I'm not quite sure that's quite the right model, although I've talked about humanism being an alternative to religion. I think he had more of a religious idea as to how humanism would pan out. He actually ran something called the Ethical Church in Bayswater. So he had a much more of a churchy idea as to what humanism would look like. But I do think that longer term, if humanism is going to be successful in this country, a couple of things I'd mention. We need to start getting some buildings. We were talking about this earlier, David.
That's right.
I think that we need to have some buildings that actually make people realise that humanism does actually have a physical presence, not just hiding ourselves away in. Community centres are great, and I'm glad I don't have to look after the church roof or anything like that. But I do think that nationally we do need to start having some buildings. I also think that Humanist UK, they do a great job. They appoint quite high-profile people to be president every 3 years. We've had some great people like Jim Al-Khalili and Alice Roberts, who are high-profile scientists. But I question the idea that the president of Humanist UK only has like a 3-year term, and it might be a scientist, and then it might be a comedian, it might be a journalist. I feel that humanism nationally needs to have almost like a figurehead, someone who can speak authoritatively for the nation, you know, in a way that the Archbishop of Canterbury will talk on national issues for the nation from a Christian point of view. I feel that we need, in the humanist movement, I feel that we need someone with real stature and real kind of gravitas, if you like, to be able to talk on ethical issues as and when the nation is facing particular difficulties.
I think that's a really interesting thing to say, because one important difference between humanism and organised religion is that organised religion tends to come from the top down, you know, but humanism is much more from the bottom up. You said earlier that individuals will have their own view, and that's perfectly respectable about what humanism is. Yeah. So that may bring with it problems in having a humanist representative or leader, but there are some basic principles, aren't there, that humanism can follow. So yes, I think.
So I'd like to see maybe a philosopher, without mentioning names. There's one or two names pop into my head, but maybe someone who has a real grasp of philosophy and ethical philosophy in particular. I'd like to see someone like that being not a figurehead, but someone who can actually speak for humanism and be in that post for longer than 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, to have a real presence in the country.
Well, when people hear this, they might share your view. David, it's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you very much.
Thanks, David. It's been great.
Yes.